Welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. My name's Jonathan Beebe. I am the professional lead for Learning Disability Nursing with the Royal College of Nursing. I'm a learning disability nurse myself. We're very pleased to be hosting this event this evening. It's one of a series of events we've been doing as part of the History of Learning Disability exhibition that the Royal College of Nursing has been doing. So there's been some great presentations so far, and I'm sure today will be no exception to that. Just wanted to say a few words about the Royal College of Nursing. We are a UK membership organisation. We represent nurses in the UK, and we have about 500,000 members, making us making us the largest professional union for nurses in the UK. Today we have Professor David Wright from McGill University in Canada. David is the Professor of History of Medicine, and he wrote a book called Down's, sorry, I have to correct me, Down's A History of Disability. We're recording the talk, so if you need to leave you can, and you come back and watch it later. But for now, I'm going to hand you over to David for his presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me, and good afternoon from Montreal, which is very sunny and very beautiful outside, I hasten to add. I just want to make a few comments before I start the presentation. First of all, it's delightful to present on behalf of the Royal College of Nursing. It just so happens that my very first academic position was a joint appointment between the School of Nursing and Midwifery and the Department of History at the University of Nottingham. So I have very fond memories of those years back in the late 1990s. I also should just say that I'm getting over a chest cold, so I might be coughing intermittently, so I apologize for that. Before I give public lectures on the history of Down syndrome, I tend to just remind everyone that I will be using language that is historical language. I'm a historian by training. I worked predominantly on the Victorian period with respect to this research. And so there will be words and turns of phrases that are used which are now considered to be offensive, and I just want you to know that I'm not going to sort of keep doing the scare quotes, but I will be using language from time to time or using titles that are obviously from the Victorian period and are not being used in any sense of meaning to be offensive or inappropriate. So without further ado, I will see if I can share my screen. We should be all used to this technology by now. So anyway, so here we go. So this is going to be a fairly brief presentation. So I'm going to be galloping a bit through the history of Down syndrome, but it's more or less the major themes are drawn from my book that I published in 2011. And I always like to start off with a sort of personal sort of anecdote here, or a personal exchange. This is paraphrased. But doctor, I don't like the look of her. Mother, after 3 sons, I like the look of her. Doctor, her fingers resemble toes, your ears are very small. Mother, do you think there was some trauma at birth? And the doctor replies, no, I think this happened at conception. Mother, remembering her Psych 101 from university, you think she's a mongoloid? Doctor, yes. Do you know a member of parliament? Mother replied, member of parliament. The doctor says, well, if you do, you can get her into an institution much faster. You shouldn't take her home because it will ruin your family life and the lives of your other children. So this exchange was more or less a verbatim exchange between my mother and her obstetrician in 1967. And it occurred after the birth of my sister, my younger sister, Susie. And it's not often that people start with a presentation of themselves in diapers, but this is me as a toddler with my younger sister, Susie, in Toronto, where we were then living in 1967. And a later picture, we grew up in London, Ontario in the 1970s. So the history of Down syndrome, the community of individuals with Down syndrome has been very much a part of my personal life as I grew up in London in the 1970s. But as I as I joined the university ranks, I went to McGill University, where I am now as an undergraduate. Became quite interested in the history of psychiatric institutions. And in the summers, I worked at an institution that was just outside of London, Ontario, called CPRI, or the Children's Psychiatric Research Institute. And this was the old facilities of a former TB sanatorium. Obviously, the TB sanatoriums all sort of closed down in the 50s and 60s. And many in Canada had been converted into long stay residential facilities for what were then called in Canada the mentally retarded. And I worked in a specific facility that specialized with children and adolescents who had severe self-injurious behavior. And by severe, I mean life-threatening self-injurious behavior. And I was involved in a number of research projects in this institute. So this sort of combined my growing interest in the history of medical institutions, the history of behavioral psychology, but also the history of what North America is referred to as developmental disability or intellectual disability, and in Britain tends to be referred to as a learning disability. But as I was an undergraduate and reading around the history of psychiatric facilities, it became clear that most of the literature was interested in the history of the, as it were, the traditional lunatic asylum, as it was known in the 19th century, large state institutions for the mentally ill. And there was very little research that had been conducted on the history of facilities for the intellectually disabled. So I arrived in England in 1990 and started my doctorate at the University of Oxford and was hanging out most of my time at the Wellcome Unit for the History of Medicine on Banbury Road in Oxford. And I decided to dedicate my doctoral thesis to the first English language institution for the developmentally disabled, which was then known in the Victorian times as the Earlswood Asylum for Idiots. And again, using the terminology of the time, it was also sometimes referred to as the National Asylum because when it was established, it was the first institution. And this is now the Royal Earlswood Hospital. And you know, if you still take the train south towards the south coast, you can, and you're going through Surrey, you can see it just off of the railway lines. It's quite an extraordinary building that was constructed in the early 1850s. Now, in the 1990s, the records of the Earlswood Asylum were in the Surrey Record Office, which was then in Kingston upon Thames. And it was just a remarkable set of primary sources, patient records, medical case books, staff records, and charitable records, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards because there were also staff wages books, which actually was a very rare insight into the early sort of generations of asylum, what were then called asylum attendants and nurses, okay, sort of as it were a precursor to psychiatric or learning disability nursing. And I'm happy to answer questions about the composition of that workforce, that institutional workforce in the mid and late Victorian period. Now, what made the Earlswood Asylum quite fascinating, at least to me, was that it was a quote unquote voluntary asylum. And by voluntary, of course, I don't mean that people entered voluntarily, but in the Victorian parlance, voluntary was a charitable asylum. That is, the funds supporting the institution were raised voluntarily. So there was a charitable organization with a board of governors that raised funds to support the Earlswood Asylum. And the asylum itself, unlike the sort of prototypical lunatic asylums, the county and borough lunatic asylums, you know, the institution was targeted towards school-age children and adolescents who were of the respectable poor, to use the Victorian term. So they were poor families that could not afford institutional or private care, but were being nominated by wealthier members of their communities for admission to the Earlswood Asylum. And the idea was that they would go there like a residential school for about 5 years, maybe renewed for another 5 years, learn basic self-help skills, occupational skills, maybe primary literacy or what have you, and then be discharged back into their community. And there's, again, fascinating primary sources, or even the cards, because the nominees had to be elected. They were literally voted on by individuals who subscribed to the institution, and the people with the highest number of votes were actually admitted to the Earlswood Asylum. So this is an example of an election card in the top right, Frederick Munns. So for those of you who are the buffs of The Crown, you may have made the connection that yes, Earlswood Asylum is the institution that was depicted in the season 4 episode of The Crown about the controversy over Catherine and Nerissa Bosley and the cousins of Lady Margaret and the Queen. So it is an episode that is supposed to represent the Earlswood Asylum. And in fact, the reporter who uncovered this in around 1987, I believe it was just a couple years before I arrived. And the institution itself was very, to say the least, nervous about, some Canadian who was claiming to be a doctoral student wanting to look at the archives of the institution. But eventually I won them over, and they pointed me towards the archives at the Surrey Record Office. Now, the Earlswood Asylum itself was perhaps most famously associated with the second medical superintendent, who was John Langdon Down. And Langdon Down was a fascinating individual, sort of a general practitioner who more or less gets one of these plum posts at one of the psychiatric facilities and rises in stature and influence and wealth. And eventually transitions into a private institution called Normalization, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, Down is known to us now because it was John Langdon Down who formulated the so-called racial or ethnic classification of idiocy, again, to use a term of the time. And so this is, of course, very controversial because it has to do with an idea of an anthropological conception of dividing the world into particular classical races, the Caucasian race, the Mongolian race, etc., the African races. But it was very much, this was sort of au courant in the 1860s to have debates over the racial division of humankind, as it were, and what were the connections between them. But Down was also an amateur photographer, and he left just a remarkable series of glass plate photographs of the residents of Earlswood, which are still available in the Surrey Record Office for those of you who want to go take a look at them. And I do believe that it was this sort of visualization, this photography that he was interested in that sort of led him to start to formulate the ideas around a particular class of residents at the Earlswood Asylum. And he published a series of articles in medical journals in the late 1860s. He was more or less resident superintendent from 1858 to 1868, in which he starts to articulate this sort of ethnic classification of intellectual disability. And here he says, I found this sort of class of patients who all sort of seem to look alike, but they don't seem to look like their parents. They seem to look like another race, and they more or less seem to resemble what he considered to be the great Mongolian family, etc. And so it's he who coins the term Mongolism or Mongoloid idiots in all sorts of variations. Now, this gets largely debunked by his contemporaries, by the scientific community, but the name sticks for more or less a century, from about the 1860s until the 1960s, when the term Mongolism, at least within the English-speaking world, gets widely used and circulated. So Down in 1868, leaves the Earlswood Asylum and founds a private institution called Normalization, which is in Teddington, and sort of bequeaths that through a couple generation of Langdon Downs. Now, interesting enough, he was always referred to as Down when he started his medical training, but then as he sort of rise in sort of social status, he sort of got the double-barreled name, which gave a sort of sense of, I don't know, of moving up in the world. So thereafter, his sons were always sort of known as Langdon Down. And his two sons both went into medicine and continued at Normalization. It was Reginald Langdon Down, depicted in the bottom right with his family, who, amongst other things, was to, as it were, identify the so-called single palmar crease, or the so-called simian crease in his drawings just before the First World War. One of the sort of fascinating ironies of the history of Down syndrome was that Reginald Langdon Down's son himself was born with Down syndrome. He's pictured there in the family photo. The Normalization now is the site of the Langdon Down Center and Museum and Archives in England. Many of you will be very, very familiar, and they give tours of Normansfield, and particularly of the fabulous theater and performance hall. So however, the rise of sort of charitable institutions more or less gets superseded in the 20th century by large state-run facilities that have various names: for the feeble-minded, for the mentally retarded, for the intellectually disabled, for the mentally deficient, to use a British term. And this is part and parcel of the early 20th century, where there's wide-scale, widespread institutionalization of individuals with disabilities, not just intellectual disabilities, but all sorts of physical disabilities as well. And the congregation of residents with similar physical and/or developmental disabilities led to quite a heightened medical interest in what was called Mongolism. A lot of speculation and hypothesis about the origins. Individuals, some arguing that it was related to intemperance, to alcoholism in parents, others saying it was related to syphilitic infection, and so these sort of competing paradigms in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. And it was not until the early 1950s that scientific technology had advanced that the early stages of what we now consider to be human genetics, as opposed to traditional genetics, starts to take off, and particularly the technique of microphotographs, right? The ability to actually see chromosomes and take pictures of them and try to identify them under a microscope and using microphotographic techniques. There are various teams that were, as it were, racing to see if they can identify chromosomal anomaly related to Mongolism, as it was then known. There's a team in Britain under Penrose. There's a team in Sweden. There's also a team in Paris under Jérôme Lejeune. It was Lejeune's team in 1958 which announced that it had identified a trisomy on chromosome 21. Just to give you an idea of how hard it was to try to decipher these, the top right is an early microphotograph, right? Later on it became very sort of standardized, but it was, these photographs were very, very difficult to take and to decipher. But it was Lejeune's team in Paris that, ironically enough, came to McGill for the International Genetic Conference to announce that they believe they had found, as it were, the origins of Mongolism. This then leads to verification by other teams, and in the 1960s, a general debate about changing the name. So in Britain, of course, because of Langdon Down, there was a great sympathy for the condition to be renamed Down syndrome. In France, they sort of rejected that. Some people suggested Lejeune syndrome, but generally is known in the French-speaking world as trisomy 21, trisomy 21. So that is sort of the brief scientific history. Oh, I'm not. There we are. Lejeune himself will go on to sort of embrace his stature as one of the great scientific discoverers of French medical history. This is a picture of him along with some others. He's second from the right, receiving the Medal of Honor from John F. Kennedy, who of course was very interested in developmental disability and in mental retardation, and new sort of community-based programs and initiatives. It was only after his death that one of his female research assistants, who was also working in the lab, suggested in the 50th anniversary of the discovery that in fact Lejeune had ripped off her discovery and more or less pushed her aside and taken credit for the discovery of the trisomy 21. So this is a huge controversy to this day in France because Lejeune had passed away and was so sort of unable to defend himself. But Marthe Gauthier wrote first in French in a French scientific journal, and later translated into English, about how more or less Lejeune and his supervisor had stolen her discovery. but that's, as it were, another story. So by the 1970s, there was a distinct movement away from long-stay psychiatric facilities. This, of course, occurred both with respect to deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, but also it affected social attitudes, public policy with respect to long-stay institutions for the learning disabled. One of the individuals most closely associated with this was Wolfensberger, who published a very influential book called The Principle of Normalization in 1972, in which he began to articulate ideas of least restrictive environments and social world valorization, the idea of normalization, of trying to find the most, as it were, normal or least restricted environments based upon individuals' ability or disability in the community. And this launched sort of decades-long discussion and fight for the rights of children, adolescents, adults with intellectual disability in terms of their right to education, their right to vote in many circumstances, the right to live in supported living accommodation in the community. Now, at this point, I always like to sort of highlight the social movement that was attached to this. Now we're moving sort of into my own lived experience, but the 1970s really was a social movement that was powered by, often by middle-class educated women in the community, children with disabilities who pushed local school boards, local authorities for greater integration, for more community facilities for their children. And I think this is often a sort of a theme that is lost amongst the great sort of medical pioneers or what have you. But I do think that there's a sort of fascinating social history, probably still yet to be written, about the, as it were, the non-professional women and local groups who in church basements and other locations pushed for the integration of their children with disabilities, as it were, sought to integrate them into the mainstream. And so slowly over the course of the post-war period, you see special schools being opened, and then you have lobbying for special classes in, as it were, normal schools, and then much later legislation for the integration of disabled children into, as it were, quote unquote, regular classes. So the 1970s and 80s was very much a period of these battles, these fights for integration in, particularly in the domains of education and community living. Many of these long stay facilities across Britain and North America began to be downsized, if not closed completely. There was a transition to what we refer to in North America as sort of group homes, sort of purpose constructed homes for maybe 5 or 6 residents or clients, whatever term you prefer, with staff in them, but in sort of regular community settings, and then onwards towards more supported independent living in apartments, for example. One of the aspects that I think is about the history of Down syndrome, which is not perhaps appreciated as much as it should, was the shift in surgeries, particularly in pediatric surgery. Now, so what's the connection there? For those of you with a good familiarity with Down syndrome will appreciate the fact that a very significant proportion of infants born with Down syndrome have very significant cardiac problems, anomalies, some of which were life-threatening. In the 1970s, it was quite common practice amongst pediatric surgeons not to operate on Down syndrome infants and to simply let, as it were, nature take its course. And this sort of fascinating debate, this ethical debate within pediatric surgery, took about 2 decades to play itself out until it was deemed to be, as it were, unethical not to intervene and engage in cardiac surgery of Down syndrome infants and children. Other domains of the disabilities, sort of, this sort of informal disability rights movement was push for the right to vote, gainful employment, debates around what are called shelter workshops, specific institutions to hire disabled children, or adolescents or young adults who are then perhaps paid under minimum wage, and what were the ethics and gains and losses associated with that. And then, this broader debate about to what extent did social integration, valorization actually achieve the goals that Wolfensberger and others originally envisaged. Certainly, I think the visual presence, if I can put it that way, of Down syndrome increased dramatically from about the 1980s onwards. This was in part due to, I think, how shall I put it, a sort of fragmentation of volunteer groups around developmental disability, learning disability. And you see the emergence of Down syndrome associations per se, that as it were break off or become sort of independent entities from learning disability associations. This was quite controversial, if I may say so, in the 80s and 90s. But it did, I think, lend to a higher profile of public campaigns around Down syndrome that were international in scope. There's now a World Down Syndrome Congress and the like. The bottom left is just a lovely series of posters put out by the Japanese Down Syndrome Society, and I had the great pleasure of going to Tokyo when my book was published translated into Japanese, and meeting that society and hearing about their activities. Perhaps the most famous was the hit American sort of, I want to call it comedy drama, a musical drama, Glee, which had not one but two lead individuals, lead actors who had Down syndrome. Now, to double back to Lejeune, one of the great controversies of the 1970s was Lejeune's sort of realization, and Lejeune was not just a French scientist, but he was a practicing Roman Catholic, that his discovery of the trisomy 21, the advances in human genetics, and combined with the emergence of amniocentesis and effectively abortion rights in the Western world was leading to the high rates of termination of pregnancies that were determined to have Down syndrome. Really 80 or 90% of those tested, and this led Lejeune himself to become an active member of the anti-abortion campaign in France, and a close confidant, interesting enough, of John Paul II in his campaign against abortion. The long-term consequences of this have been widely debated. For those of you who haven't seen what I consider to be quite striking article in the Atlantic Monthly about the potential, as it were, of the end of Down syndrome children in Western countries with publicly funded amniocentesis and advanced technologies, it's really quite a riveting, and I think actually very sort of balanced and moving article about the ethical and social issues around this, focusing particularly on Denmark, but obviously the repercussions are beyond that. Just as a summary, to double back to my sister, whom I'm always very proud of and very grateful to in terms of allowing me to talk about her life story. She ended up working in various part-time jobs in the community and McDonald's, and working sometimes in shelter workshops. She was one of the first Canadians, as far as I know, with Down syndrome to get married in the 1990s. And she continues to live quite a full life, and she just turned 55 a couple weeks ago in London, Ontario, and again in a sort of semi-independent living situation. So I think I'll wrap it up there. For those of you who, I guess, not to plug my own book, I promise you I don't get any royalties off of this, but for those of you who want to sort of learn more about the history of Down syndrome, Oxford University Press were very kind to publish this sort of ghastly green book on the history of Down syndrome. That is the top right. And so I would just encourage you to read more, to ask questions after this lecture. Thank you very much.